The story begins behind the cold, gray walls of Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, 1951. The cells were overcrowded, the air thick with disinfectant and sweat, and the prisoners, mostly young men doing time for petty crimes, had no idea they were about to become part of one of the government's darkest secrets. A flyer appeared on the notice board. Volunteers needed for medical research, easy tests, good pay. To desperate inmates, it sounded like salvation. A few dollars meant cigarettes, better food, maybe even early parole. None of them could have imagined that research meant being exposed to chemical agents, radioactive materials, and hallucinogens under the veil of national security. The man behind it all was Dr. Albert Kligman, a respected dermatologist from the University of Pennsylvania, charismatic, ambitious, and brilliant. He saw Holmesburg not as a prison, but as what he later called acres of skin. When he first entered the facility, he was escorted by guards who joked about his human lab. He smiled. Within weeks, he'd signed an agreement with the prison warden to begin dermatological studies funded by government grants. But the truth was buried deep in a chain of secret authorizations. The CIA, through its shadowy mkultra program, was searching for ways to control the human mind, enhance interrogation, and test the limits of chemical endurance. They needed subjects who couldn't refuse. Prisoners were perfect, cheap, contained, and easily silenced. Inside the infirmary, experiments began quietly. Inmates were told they'd be testing creams for skin health or vitamin absorption. In reality, many were injected with dioxin, the same compound later known as a key ingredient in Agent Orange. Others were exposed to LSD, 25, and sensory deprivation sessions designed to break psychological resistance. At first, there were no alarms. The men laughed about their science paydays. They compared scars and burns like badges. But within weeks, things changed. Some woke up with blistering skin that peeled in sheets. Others began hearing whispers, claiming the walls breathed at night. Those who complained were told it was an allergic reaction or nerves. Guards called them weak. Unbeknownst to the prisoners, the program was expanding. CIA couriers arrived every month carrying sealed metal cases labeled property of U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Kligman received instructions written in cryptic codes, new compounds to test, new dosage levels to record. Notes were sent back to Washington, never signed, only initialed. The prison chaplain noticed the change first. He reported inmates suffering from sudden paranoia, insomnia, and violent hallucinations. But when he questioned Dr. Kligman, the doctor brushed it off. They're prisoners, Reverend. They hallucinate freedom. Outside those walls, the Cold War was escalating. America feared that the Soviets were mastering chemical warfare and brainwashing. Every government lab raced to find countermeasures, or weapons of their own. Inside Holmesburg, those fears took human form. One subject, James Stanley, later described the moment his reality broke. I saw my reflection in the mirror, but it wasn't me. My eyes were moving, but my body wouldn't. They told me it was the medicine, but I knew they'd done something else. Stanley was later transferred without explanation. His records disappeared. Through the early 1950s, Holmesburg's research grew into a full-scale operation. Hundreds of tests were logged, each signed off by university officials unaware or unwilling to ask what was really being studied. Some experiments were sponsored by pharmaceutical companies seeking fast-track results. Others came directly from classified military budgets. The lines blurred between medicine and manipulation. The inmates became data points, each one cataloged by number, never by name. Skin samples were preserved in jars. Reaction charts filled cabinets marked restricted human testing. Yet outside, the prison's public image improved. Officials boasted that Holmesburg was contributing to medical progress. Newspapers praised its volunteer programs. Not a single reporter was allowed inside the infirmary. Then, in 1958, a new phase began. CIA handlers introduced Project Dermal, a subdivision of mkultra focusing on the effects of airborne toxins and psychological strain. Prisoners were locked in sealed rooms filled with faint mist, told to breathe normally. Some passed out. Others awoke unable to remember their own names for days. The prison doctor's notes from that year contain one chilling line. Subject 47 exhibited extreme compliance after third exposure. Recommend continued conditioning. No one outside knew what conditioning meant, but among inmates, whispers spread of the secret basement room, the White Room, where men entered strapped to gurneys and came back silent, eyes vacant, movement slow. Rumors grew that the government was testing mind control drugs, that they were trying to erase fear, emotion, even individuality. Most dismissed it as paranoia, until one man escaped. In the summer of 1963, Harold Blake, serving 5 years for burglary, slipped out during a maintenance detail. He carried with him something the government didn't expect, a letter describing what he had witnessed inside the medical unit. It was smuggled through a sympathetic chaplain and addressed to a local reporter. That single envelope, stamped from Philadelphia County Jail, would ignite the first public spark in a story buried under 2 decades of silence. The letter reached the newsroom of the Philadelphia Courier in the autumn of 1963. It was a single page, handwritten in shaky pencil. No return address. Just 3 words at the top. Holmesburg Prison Experiments. Reporter Martha Givens nearly threw it away until she noticed a line near the bottom. They put things on our skin that burn through to the bone. They say it's medicine, but men are dying. The letter was signed, Harold B. She visited the prison a week later posing as a journalist researching prison reform. The warden smiled politely, assured her everything was humane and voluntary, and offered a stage tour of the cell blocks. She wasn't allowed near the infirmary, but she caught glimpses, hallways sealed by metal doors, faint chemical smells leaking through vents, guards posted outside as if protecting something valuable. When she spoke with inmates through the chapel, she heard the same phrase repeated. Don't talk about the tests. One man lifted his sleeve to reveal a patch of skin discolored and cratered. Another whispered. They called it the White Room. Back at her office, Martha compared the signatures in the prison's visitor log with funding reports she requested from the University of Pennsylvania. One name appeared in both places, Dr. Albert Kligman. A few more nights of digging revealed something far more disturbing. A paper trail connecting Kligman's research to a CIA front called the Society for Human Ecology, a group already tied to the infamous mkultra program. When Martha's editor read her first draft, he went pale. Are you sure you want to print this? You're accusing the U.S. government of human experimentation. I'm not accusing, she replied. I'm quoting. The article, titled Men or Mice, hit newsstands on March 4th, 1964. It described in detail the testimonies of Holmesburg inmates, the mysterious compounds, and the federal grants funding them. Within 24 hours, the phones at the newspaper rang nonstop. Some calls praised her bravery. Others carried thinly veiled threats. One caller identified himself only as Major D and warned, "You're treading in classified territory. For your own safety, drop it." But it was too late. The story was spreading fast. Within weeks, other reporters followed the trail, uncovering military purchase orders for dermal dispersion studies, contract with private chemical labs, and invoices for volatile agents tested on confined subjects. The CIA denied everything. The Pentagon issued a single sentence. No record of such program exists. Behind closed doors, damage control began. Files were moved, destroyed, or relabeled under new project codes. The warden at Holmesburg was transferred to another facility. Dr. Kligman's funding quietly doubled. Meanwhile, Martha received envelopes with no return address, each containing fragments of internal documents. One memo, dated 1957, read, "Subjects exhibit increasing compliance under isolation and auditory stress. Recommend continuation at reduced dose for long-term conditioning results." Another contained photos. Men strapped to chairs under bright lamps, gauze wrapped around their arms. A clipboard nearby marked Project Dermal. By the time federal investigators arrived, the medical wing had been scrubbed clean. Cabinets were empty, samples destroyed, the guards' logs rewritten. One guard later confessed that an unmarked van had entered the compound 2 days before the inspection and left just before dawn. Congress took notice. A Senate committee opened preliminary hearings on ethical medical testing, but without hard proof, the case fizzled. The government labeled the allegations unverified. Still, whispers spread through academia. Some professors distanced themselves from Kligman, others defended him, calling his work pioneering dermatological research. The prisoners' voices were drowned in scientific jargon and political denial. Then, in 1971, after nearly a decade of silence, a military scientist turned whistleblower, Dr. Richard L. Martins, confirmed that Holmesburg had indeed been part of a broader classified network studying the effects of chemical agents and psychological stress on human subjects. He claimed the project's funding was buried under agricultural and pharmaceutical budgets. Martins testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, who had already begun probing CIA mind control operations. Under oath, Martins admitted, "We were told the subjects were volunteers, but they weren't given any real choice. Most didn't even know what was being tested." His confession made national headlines, but by then, the Cold War paranoia had hardened public apathy. America wanted to forget. Inside Holmesburg, the experiments continued quietly until 1974, disguised as drug trials. Former participants like James Stanley filed lawsuits claiming psychological trauma and neurological damage. The government invoked sovereign immunity, arguing that classified operations could not be litigated. Stanley's case reached the Supreme Court in 1987 and was dismissed. The justices ruled that soldiers and prisoners cannot seek damages for injuries sustained during service-related experiments. It was a legal victory for secrecy and a death sentence for truth. As years passed, the survivors aged, their scars fading but their nightmares constant. Many struggled with paranoia, insomnia, and memory loss. Some took their own lives. Others kept boxes of yellow documents and half-burned photos, proof that what they endured had really happened. In 1999, when part of mkultra were finally declassified, the truth began leaking through cracks in time. Documents surfaced confirming that Holmesburg Prison was indeed used for psychochemical experimentation on inmate populations. For Martha Givens, the vindication came too late. She'd left journalism after years of threats and financial ruin. In her final interview before her death, she said quietly, "The real tragedy wasn't the experiments. It was how easily we believed the excuses. We wanted to think our government couldn't do this, but it did." Holmesburg's name faded from the headlines, replaced by new wars and new scandals. But in forgotten archives, sealed folders still bore its code. Project Dermal, active 1951 to 1974. And somewhere deep in those pages, a single notation stands out, one that would open the final, most chilling chapter of all. By the late 1990s, the world had almost forgotten Holmesburg Prison. The compound sat empty, its razor wire rusting, windows shattered, medical wards sealed by thick chains. But deep inside a government storage facility in Virginia, thousands of yellowing folders waited in silence. When the Department of Defense began declassifying Cold War-era documents in 1999, a small box marked mkultra subprojects 36 to 52 caught the attention of archivist Diana Kelser. Inside were black and white photos of inmates, bandaged arms, blistered faces, numbers scrawled on their chests instead of names. In the margins, someone had written, Holmesburg, Human Dermal Exposure Tests, 1951 to 1974. For decades, the official story was that the experiments were voluntary and harmless. But these papers told another story. Dosage logs, chemical inventories, and test results labeled classified, biological warfare relevance. There was in cold typewritten ink, Project Dermal, directly connected to the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division. When the files surfaced, former inmate Alan Mays was already in his 70s. He'd spent half his life trying to convince anyone who would listen that what happened to him was real. When he finally saw his own photo in a declassified folder, his arm raw and bleeding from chemical burns, he wept. They called it science, he said in an interview, but we were just bodies they didn't mind breaking. He and a handful of survivors formed the Holmesburg Prison Survivors Association and demanded accountability from the government and the University of Pennsylvania. Their petition asked for only two things: a public apology and fair compensation. Both requests were denied. The Department of Justice argued that the statute of limitations had expired. The university issued a brief statement of regret. Carefully avoiding any admission of guilt, Dr. Albert Kligman, still respected in his field, dismissed the accusations as emotional exaggerations. He died in 2010, wealthy, decorated, and unpunished, but evidence kept surfacing. Documentary filmmakers uncovered reels of footage, grainy 16mm film shot by military cameramen in the 1950s. The tapes showed shirtless inmates lined in rows, chemicals being brushed onto their backs, and narrators' calm voice describing observations of epidermal breakdown. One film clip ended with Kligman smiling at the camera, saying, "They're the perfect subjects. Controlled environment, compliant behavior." That footage never aired on television. Networks feared legal retaliation from the CIA and the university. But leaked versions circulated online in the early 2000s, sparking outrage among younger generations who had never heard the story. As public interest grew, journalists like Diana Fields reopened the investigation. She uncovered proof that Holmesburg wasn't alone. Similar voluntary testing had taken place at Sing Sing, San Quentin, and a federal hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, all under different code names. The pattern was unmistakable. Prisoners, patients, and soldiers, all considered expendable test subjects in the name of national defense. In 2001, a congressional subcommittee quietly acknowledged that ethical boundaries were likely violated during Cold War research, but stopped short of naming specific programs. Once again, bureaucracy smothered accountability. For the survivors, the trauma never faded. Many suffered chronic pain, anxiety, and hallucinations long after their release. Some described recurring dreams of the White Room, the blinding lights, the smell of disinfectant, the sound of footsteps fading into echo. One man claimed he could still taste the metallic air whenever he closed his eyes. When filmmakers released A Forgotten Experiment in 2005, it reignited the story for a brief moment. The documentary combined declassified footage, survivor interviews, and expert testimony. It premiered at a small film festival in New York, where audience members sat in stunned silence. One reviewer wrote, "It's not horror fiction, it's history that was erased." Yet within a month, the film disappeared from public circulation after licensing disputes. Rumors spread that sponsors had been pressured to withdraw. But pirated copies lived on, passed between researchers, students, and human rights advocates. Then, in 2022, history finally shifted. After years of petitions, protests, and academic pressure, the University of Pennsylvania issued a public apology to the victims of the Holmesburg experiments. The statement read, "The university acknowledges the unethical and inhumane research conducted on incarcerated individuals at Holmesburg Prison. We express deep regret and apologize to those affected." It was a single paragraph, decades too late. No compensation, no criminal accountability, just words. Still, for survivors like Alan Mays, it meant something. "They can't undo it," he said, "but at least the truth is written down now. That's all we wanted, to be remembered." Holmesburg Prison officially closed in 1995. Its remaining wings used for film shoots and urban exploration. Graffiti covers the walls now, some crude, some hauntingly poetic. One phrase stands out, spray painted above the locked medical unit. "We were your experiment." As cameras pan across its decaying corridors, the story of Holmesburg feels like a ghost, the kind that refuses to fade, no matter how many times it's buried. Among the last pages of the declassified files, one final entry stands out. It's dated March 17th, 1973, typed in fading ink. Subject 47, exhibiting prolonged psychological dissociation. Recommend termination of program. Archive data under classified level 4, Biological Effects Division. No name, no signature, just that line. And beneath it, scrawled in pen by an unknown hand, one final note. "Forget nothing. Because buried within those forgotten files lies the truth of a nation that tested its own citizens in the name of science, and then erased them from history. But the records still exist. The names still echo. And every declassified page reminds us, some experiments never end.